Are we better off trying to forget painful, potentially divisive memories? Do we get along better when we avoid opening old wounds? Why is it often so difficult to work through the past? And what are the potential benefits of doing so? These are the questions we explore in Realms of Memory. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian, and in today's episode, we look at how, over 75 years on, Japan continues to be divided over the memory of the Asia-Pacific War. This 15-year conflict, which stretched from 1931 to 1945, continues to be described as Japan's history problem. It's a problem that strains relations between Japan and its neighbors. It's a problem that fuels considerable distrust of Japan's political leaders. In many respects, Yasukuni Shrine, located in the heart of the nation's capital, has come to symbolize Japan's history problem. To delve into this subject, we are very fortunate to welcome Associate Professor of History Akiko Takanaka from the University of Kentucky to discuss her book, Yasukuni Shrine, History, Memory, and Japan's Unending Post-War. Akiko, thank you for taking time to join this episode of Realms of Memory.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
To begin, could you help us understand what is Yasukuni Shrine and why has it become so controversial?
The easiest way to explain it is sort of a military memorial, right? For all of the members of the Japanese military who died at war between 1868 and 1945. And the assumption is that when you die at war for the emperor, your spirit is summoned into the shrine and transformed into a god, or merged into a god that is supposed to protect the nation of Japan. It has become a problem starting in the 1970s when, the men who had been convicted as Class A war criminals had been enshrined at Yasukuni in 1978. And when that word got out, right, it became a shrine that represents all of Japan's war crimes to the left and to the international audience. But for the right, though, Yasukuni Shrine still symbolizes, Japan's nationalism. And it is something that sort of reaffirms the families some of the families who have lost their family members, loved ones to the war. So there's the left and the right, and the shrine is sort of caught in between.
Akiko argues that calls to destroy the shrine or to replace it with a new national memorial to the nation's war dead are not the answer to Japan's history problem. Instead, the Japanese need to take on the difficult task of working through their past. In many respects, focusing blame on Yasukuni for Japan's crimes in the Asia-Pacific War is a way of avoiding that work by scapegoating a symbol of a regime and its leaders who no longer exist.
In a way, I think that the shrine is a very convenient presence for the Japanese left, who do acknowledge that Japan committed crimes during the 14 years between 1931 and 1945, but that if the left keeps blaming the shrine for, convincing young men to die at war, right? That was the most courageous thing to do. And it didn't matter what else you did, as long as you died for the emperor. And so that kind of narrative, the left latches onto and can argue that is why Japan committed war crimes, instead of really, working on educating the youth about Japan's past. Sort of a parallel to all the critical race theory issues that are going around in the United States right now. Education is very important in Japan, but, many lawmakers have shied away from going in that direction. They're having lawsuits in the 70s and 80s about, how to teach the history of modern Japan, but that's not been dealt with more recently. And so it's sort of, to oversimplify, as long as the left is blaming the shrine, it doesn't have to confront Japan's traumatic past.
By exploring the larger history of Yasukuni, Akiko takes us beyond the contemporary polemics surrounding the shrine. We come to appreciate how the shrine functioned as part of the Meiji Reformation, the period of dramatic political change beginning in the mid-19th century, which created the modern Japanese nation and national identity.
Japan before Meiji did not really have a collective identity as a nation. In a way, people were more loyal to the daimyo of their individual domain. And there was a strong domain identity, but not a big national identity as a nation. And so this idea of, commemorating everyone together in one place seemed new to me, and that's where I started researching. That's sort of the very beginning that I was looking into, and I learned that Choshu domain, where the majority of the earliest leaders of the Meiji government came from, and it's still true today. A lot of the recent politicians come from that area too. But Choshu domain, which is at the western end of the biggest island of Japan, they were conducting sort of this domain-wide rituals to remember the lives lost for the cause of their particular domain. And there are no existing records about this to sort of definitively say that this is the case, but I'm speculating that that is where this idea came from. And the leaders of the new government decided to sort of expand what they were doing back in Choshu domain to a nationwide project, especially to sort of create a new national identity, collective identity, through one memorial. And this is a time where Japan was being sort of pressured from the outside, right? And so when you get pressure from the outside, you have to develop a sort of a collective identity, and it came as a part of that process.
Using the shrine to form a new Japanese identity was no easy task. For decades, those who visited the shrine came primarily from the Tokyo area. Their motivation for going to Yasukuni had little or nothing to do with any kind of national or patriotic sentiment.
Well, initially, it was just the local people. And there were all these rituals to appease the dead that had been going on traditionally, like sumo matches and fireworks and things like that. Started to take place on the shrine grounds. And so, the local people would go to enjoy the space, right? And enjoy the events. And so I read a lot of, diaries and memoirs of writers who grew up in the area. And then they would talk about it as like a park, a very cool Western style park. And that they went to go see circuses and horse races and things like that. And so in a way, it was just a famous spot. And the other thing was that a lot of the structures that were built, like there are two big stone lanterns flanking the main gateway to the shrine grounds. That became very popular because it was a very beautiful site. It was on top of a slope of Kudan. And because, Tokyo wasn't as built as today, you could sort of take in the Tokyo Bay from the shrine grounds. And in 1870, oh no, I'm forgetting the year now, they built the original structure of the Yasukuni Military Museum. And that was one of the earliest Western style buildings. So people went to the shrine grounds for those purposes. And they weren't very conscious about what the shrine was for and who it was enshrining.
Very gradually, Yasukuni did become a site of what Akiko describes as institutionalized joy. As Japan embarked on its own project of imperialist expansion at the end of the 19th century, with wars against China, then Russia, Yasukuni became a place for the celebration of Japan's military victories.
Two main events really helps sort of nurture this this institutionalization of joy. And it's the two wars that happened around the turn of the 20th century. So Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, and the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. And Sino-Japanese War was the first major international war that modern Japan had fought. And, the Japanese people are overjoyed because, they all know that China is such a big country. Of course, what they don't know is that China was a very weak country at that time because it had been so damaged, right, by the Opium Wars. But there's a lot of joy in understanding that Japan is modernizing and becoming more stronger internationally as well. And so a lot of celebratory events take place at Yasukuni Shrine. Same with the Russo-Japanese War too, where there is a lot of displays of spoils of war, and they are celebrating on the shrine grounds all these victories. But what the local people, for the most part, didn't know was that the night before the celebration, the enshrinement of the war dead had taken place on the very same shrine grounds. Especially the first Sino-Japanese War, very few people died on the Japanese side. So, a lot of people did not know somebody who lost a family member. It changes with the Russo-Japanese War. But the celebration is really in the forefront during those two wars. And it's not just at Yasukuni Shrine, and especially during the Russo-Japanese War, there's a big space in front of the palace where the emperor resides, and that too became a space for celebration. Ueno Park also became a space for celebration. And then Yasukuni grounds, right? And so these three spots were sort of connected by victory parades and decorated trolley cars and lantern parades and things like that. And the whole city was celebrating. And the fact that, right, one of the key sites is Yasukuni Shrine, where all the people who had died are being enshrined, is really sort of not brought to the foreground. And so people are all about celebrating and not really thinking about the war dead at this point.
First understood as a site of leisure and entertainment, then as a space to celebrate military victories, it took decades before Yasukuni became a belief system. Here, Akiko stresses the important role played by the newly created Japanese school system in educating children about how to understand the religious significance of Yasukuni. This education was reinforced by a variety of group activities intended to anchor what children were learning in school.
Well, education is central, and the Ministry of Education kept updating the textbooks, and especially if you look at the history textbooks or the ethics textbooks, there are, chapters devoted to Yasukuni Shrine where the textbooks are explaining to the children the significance of Yasukuni Shrine, right? So if you die at war, you're enshrined here, and that's the greatest deed that you can achieve if you're a boy. And even the emperor comes to pay tribute to you, to the shrine. And the entries are sort of, what's the right way to put it? Organized so that it matches the festival dates of the shrine. So, for example, there's a spring festival in April, and then there's a fall festival in October. And if you look at the textbooks, those chapters would fall on the time period, the festival, and gradually, the government, Ministry of Education starts to sort of mandate schools to incorporate rituals that has to do with Yasukuni Shrine into their, everyday activities, or there will be school trips. There are these graduation trips, which is not the kind of graduation trips that happen in the US, but for example, so elementary school in Japan is 6 years. On your 6th year, at some point, you get to take a collective trip through your school, couple of nights away. It happens the last year of junior high school, the last year of high school as well. And the Ministry of Education starts to pressure a lot of the elementary schools in particular to bring the students to Tokyo to visit Yasukuni Shrine as a part of the graduation school trip. So there are these things that are being sort of gradually mandated from Tokyo to the local schools.
Once the Asia-Pacific War began in 1931, the use of group activities to show proper forms of respect and reverence for the military and the war dead took on an entirely new magnitude of importance. Through group activities, which were often compulsory, social conformity became a powerful mechanism for indoctrinating the Japanese in right ways of thinking and behaving.
So there are a variety of units, and schools can be a unit, right? Or youth groups that were present in every village, or neighborhood associations, or even workplaces. And so things that are sort of reported as volunteers doing X, Y, and Z, it's usually children doing something as a class because the school principal may have pressured the homeroom teacher to take the kids to go volunteer somewhere. But these are always reported as voluntary things. And I think I talk about one celebration, was it? And then it's sort of reported as this spontaneous event, but in fact, they were being told by the neighborhood association to congregate on top of this mountain in order to offer a prayer and things like that. So it is under pressure, but at the same time, if you are either celebrating or offering respect to in the direction of the imperial palace, or going to visit Yasukuni Shrine, if you do this in groups, you're sort of watching each other in a way, and so you're mutually surveilling each other, right? Which means that you can't really go out of step, which means that everyone's sort of behaving and internally censoring their movements and their expressions. But then when you look at each other, when you look around, what you see is this sort of product of self-censorship, right? And then so you're looking at other people, and then you're kind of like, oh, they seem happy, so this must be a happy occasion. They are doing this with such enthusiasm, so that must be true. And then for many, it becomes, this is sort of a practice in indoctrination, and that some people would gradually start to believe the actions that they are taking.
The commitment of Japan's wartime regime to harnessing the power of groups to show respect and reverence for the war dead was extraordinary. Just as the Meiji government had orchestrated the institutionalization of joy through celebrations of Japan's military victories at the turn of the 20th century, it now focused on the institutionalization of grief. The attention and detail devoted to the proper treatment and sentiments owed to the war dead were intended to help the Japanese to internalize a sense of pride and joy rather than sadness and grief that their loved ones had died in the service of the nation. Akiko uses the case of one ordinary foot soldier, Private Umekichi, killed early on in the Asia-Pacific War to illustrate this point.
So this is a young man who enlists in, I believe, 1934, and he goes to, Manchuria to ostensibly protect a Japanese academy there. And a few days after his training is done, he is killed while he's sent on a mission. And yes, he is treated with a lot of care. His body is cremated in a Buddhist service, and some of his ashes are buried in a local cemetery. The rest of his ashes are carried back home in the hands of a superior. And right, it takes a train through Manchuria to the south to Dalian, and then takes a boat from there to Kobe, and then train to Kanagawa, which is a prefecture south of Tokyo. And along the way, these are patriotic women's groups. They greet the train, which of course means that they have been supplied with schedules, right? And instructed to gather at a particular station at a particular time to sort of welcome and pay tribute to this box of ashes traveling home. And he finally comes home. The mayor goes with the parents to retrieve the ashes. The village hosts a big funeral, and dozens and dozens of people line up for the funeral parade. The house is receiving guests for days after the funeral. They even, receive a token gift in the name of the emperor and the empress. Of course, this is earlier on in the war, and Japan's not in an all-out war yet, which means that the number of people killed are not very high. So it was possible to do this. And then a few months later, the family receives an invitation to the memorial service at Yasukuni Shrine. And what happens is that, they get to travel. And this was for every war dead, right? Kanagawa is very close to Tokyo, but regardless of where you lived, you received an invitation, discounted train tickets. You had a place to stay for several nights in Tokyo, and then you would travel to Tokyo. You would attend the memorial service, and then you also got to sightsee in Tokyo. And all of this was preserved in multiple photographs that were compiled into a photo album that the family received in the mail at a later date. So that is a lot going on for, a foot soldier.
As the war grew in scope and scale, enshrinement at Yasukuni, broadcast to all of the nation, helped prepare the living for the far greater loss of life in the years ahead.
It's educating, especially the bereaved family, but the rest of Japan, right? Because all of Japan was going to become bereaved families. Every single family was going to lose somebody at war, and that was the projection, the way that Japan was fighting, which was pretty reckless. And that meant that, the correct emotion of the family left behind was supposed to be gratitude. They were supposed to be grateful to have been able to devote their son to the emperor. So it wasn't supposed to be sadness or grief. It was supposed to be gratitude. And that this gratitude was to be practiced in groups at Yasukuni Shrine. And then this is disseminated throughout Japan through media, right? And then there's live radio going on of the memorial service. And so the whole nation is vicariously experiencing these commemorative events. And so then this is, as you say, an educational moment for all of Japan, where they're watching the bereaved families express their gratitude, and they're learning that that's how they are supposed to act when their turn comes.
While the sentiment of gratitude was sincerely felt by many and helped them cope with the loss of a loved one, it was by no means the case for everyone. In many instances, the media edited out anything that might fly in the face of how the Japanese were expected and instructed to behave when grieving the war dead.
It depends on your demographic. It depends on your education level. And so I have an excerpt of a group discussion amongst elderly mothers who had just lost their only son, and they're sort of and the only son who had been their only family. I don't know how they find these women, but and they are talking about it's all gratitude, right? That they are talking about. And with that demographic, I feel like maybe they did really believe in that. And they had believed that they were supposed to be grateful, and they were. And in a way, it's a coping mechanism too, right? If what they lost was for a good cause, maybe it is something that they can live with. But that's juxtaposed with this sort of recounting of an experience by a radio announcer who was doing like live radio announcing of one of the memorial rituals, and there were like screams coming from the groups of bereaved families, like, murderer, give me back my son. And he's like remembering decades later that he had to try so hard to prevent the microphone from picking up those words, and that was like the most difficult thing that he did during his time as an announcer.
Following Japan's defeat, General Douglas MacArthur, given far-reaching powers to reshape a new democratic Japan, allowed for the survival of Yasukuni on the grounds that there would henceforth be a strict separation of state and religion in Japan. Banned from direct involvement with Yasukuni, the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, which governed Japan for much of the post-war era, nevertheless used its ties to Yasukuni to build its political base of support.
LDP pretty much came to power by catering to the bereaved families and by sort of promising that they would sort of restore Yasukuni Shrine to its former glory, right? Because at the end of the war, the government had to pull its support from Yasukuni Shrine, and Yasukuni Shrine was privatized, which means that it's a private religious entity and the government can't officially have anything to do with it. So there was that constitutionality issue as well.
Despite the constitutionally required separation of state and religion, LDP leaders did visit Yasukuni Shrine. However, in deference to the Constitution, they went to great lengths to avoid visiting Yasukuni in an official capacity.
They always try to sort of skirt the constitutionality issue and, not go on August 15th or say that they're going in a private capacity, right? So they would say that I'm here as a person. I'm here as a private person, or some would say that, well, my uncle is enshrined here, my brother is enshrined here, and that's who I came to see.
All of this changed in 1985 when Prime Minister Nakasone made a dramatic break with political precedent.
Doesn't really become a huge international problem until 1985, when then Prime Minister Nakasone visits Yasukuni Shrine on August 15th, which is the day that Japan commemorates the end of the war. Even though it's not an official day, right? It's not the day that the San Francisco Treaty was signed, and it was the day that the emperor announced that he was ending the war. But in any case, so Nakasone went to Yasukuni Shrine on August 15th, and he declared that he is there in his official capacity as the Prime Minister of Japan. China is enraged by this because, the optics, right? The Prime Minister, the leader of Japan, going to pay tribute to a shrine in which Class A war criminals are worshipped. The optics of that was just so horrible. And that's when the Yasukuni issue really becomes an issue.
Yasukuni wasn't just an international issue that enraged Japan's neighbors. It also caused serious rifts at home. Okinawans, whose prefecture was the only place where fighting actually took place on Japanese soil, were shocked to discover that many of their loved ones had also been enshrined at Yasukuni. A once independent kingdom, annexed by Japan in the 19th century, many Okinawans felt that they had been brutally treated by the Japanese military and sacrificed by the Tokyo government in a hopeless conflict. How was it that a site devoted to the military war dead also included Okinawan civilians? Here, Akiko explains how Okinawans found themselves caught up in another form of collaboration between the shrine and the LDP leadership.
Right after the Allied occupation ended, at the end of April 1952, the Japanese government passes this law called War Injured and War Bereaved Families Act. And in Japanese, this is engoho. And it was, a monetary support in forms of pensions and one-time gifting of money to the bereaved families. In order to receive this fund, the family member had to, fill out paperwork and say that, so this is my husband and this is his, personal biological information. He was killed in this area on this date, I'm requesting financial support. And so bereaved families started to do this. The following year, in August of 1953, this engoho is expanded to Okinawan civilians. And this is because many civilians aided the Japanese military in Okinawa. And so the expanded engoho stipulated that Okinawans, if you can if you can demonstrate the ways in which you helped the Japanese military, you will be covered by this engoho and you will get money. And, many Okinawans were impoverished and they had, many had conflicted emotions about this, but many filed this paperwork in order to get financial support that they desperately needed. Now, there was one more component of this story that I need to introduce here first before moving on. And one key piece of information that is needed here is that, so the elaborate enshrinement ritual that Umekichi was lucky, or Umekichi's family was lucky enough to experience, not all the bereaved families got to experience that. And that is because the death toll kept rising and rising and rising, especially in the last 3 years of the war. And so the memorial services started lagging behind because, you got to invite the family members and do this elaborate thing. And so many people, hundreds and thousands of people were dying. And at the end, 2.3 million and some change men lost their lives, which meant that in August 1945, when the war ends, only about 10% of the dead had been enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine, which means 90% of 2.3 million, I'm not going to do the math, but a significant number of people had still not been enshrined. And so Yasukuni Shrine wants to memorialize all the outstanding members, but since it's being privatized, it doesn't have the resources that it used to have. And so it reaches out to the government for help. Of course, because of the Constitution, the government is not supposed to help the shrine. But they strike a deal. The government had this internal document of all the list of the people who had applied for pension through this engoho. And the government suggested to the shrine that they request this information, sort of like a, what's the word, Open Information Act, right?
Mm-hmm.
The government is obliged to respond to requests. And so they go through this process, and the Yasukuni Shrine very efficiently is able to get the names of all the names and other information of the remaining 90% of the war dead. However, mixed into this list, right, were the Okinawans too, who had filed for the same pension. So their names kind of accidentally ended up being in this list, and they accidentally ended up getting enshrined at Yasukuni. And apparently there are names of somebody who died, a 1-year-old who died, or there were names of like a 90-something-year-old man who died, who clearly did not aid the military, but their names ended up being included into the register of the shrine.
How the Japanese remember the Asia-Pacific War today and how they think about Yasukuni is profoundly shaped by important generational differences. Akiko identifies 2 generations in particular, an older generation exposed to the nationalist education system and the devastation of Japan at the end of the war, and a younger generation, born well after the war, in a time of peace and unprecedented prosperity.
So first, the generation that were children during the war, because the war lasted for such a long time, right? If you're born anytime between 1931 and I don't know, early 1940s, your whole life is about war, and you are receiving lessons using the most nationalistic, most revisionist textbooks. And so if you don't know anything else, that's your entire world. And your entire world is that the emperor is God, and Japan's war is this holy war, and it's almost like manifest destiny, right? You grow up believing in that because that's the only world you know. And so many people talk about the tremendous sense of betrayal that they felt in August 1945, that the adults were all lying to them. And that becomes augmented when school starts again, right? And the teachers had been told to instruct what parts of the textbook to blacken out, because there were no money to produce new textbooks right after the war. And so these children are told to black out with ink, in some cases like pages after pages, because those were propaganda basically. And their teachers, right, who had been teaching them that the emperor is God and so on and so forth, are all of a sudden talking about democracy. And so there too, they experience this tremendous sense of betrayal. And so their anger is directed towards adults more generally, but most importantly, the government, because for them, it's the political and military leaders that betrayed them.
Not only does this older generation tend to be the most critical of Yasukuni as a surviving legacy of the wartime regime, it has also been the driving force behind Japan's commitment to peace education. Japan has, by far, the preponderance of the world's peace museums. Many of these museums were founded by this older generation during the era of the Vietnam War.
So a lot of the peace museums have been built in areas that have experienced heavy air raids. Like Osaka, like there's another one in Saitama, there's one in Kawasaki. There are many peace museums, and many of them started with the effort to preserve memories of the local air raid experience. And the kind of people who can talk about local air raid experiences, either women or men who were too young to be drafted at that time, right? So the men who were too young to be drafted, many tended to be of that generation who experienced war as a child and received the nationalistic education. And so the leaders behind some of these museums are indeed people from that generation.
Much like the blame cast on Yasukuni for brainwashing a generation of Japanese and fueling the tragedy of the war, the experience of the air raids that dominates Japan's peace museums also depicts the Japanese as victims of the Asia-Pacific War. The memory trigger for this perspective was Japan's role as a staging ground for the Vietnam War.
Victimhood narratives sell, and the victimhood narratives are a very convenient way to build a collective identity. And who wants to remember your country as the oppressor, right? And the people who were at war and survived and came back, they didn't talk about their experiences because it's not something that they were proud of. It's not something that they wanted to share. And so the vocal ones ended up becoming the survivors of the air raid experience. And it's a little more complicated because the drives to collect and preserve memories started during Vietnam. And the United States was using Japan and South Korea as a base, right, to fight the war in Vietnam from. And the Japanese people knew that. And because it was such a televised war, unlike Korea, Japanese people started seeing, the exact same bombs that had fallen on top of them, falling on northern Vietnam. And that's when some of these men in particular started to be like, we need to talk about how horrible that experience was. And we need to tell the people, and it's not that Japanese people could stop the war, right? Because it's the government's treaty with the United States that was enabling all of this. But there was a huge anti-Vietnam movement in Japan as well. And this move to collect air raid memories started as a part of the anti-Vietnam movement.
The younger generation, born well after the war, are caught between narratives of suffering and victimization that pervade post-war Japanese society, and the outrage by Japan's neighbors that it has not done enough to make amends for the past.
But the other generation that you're talking about, the generation born after the war, and obviously I belong to that generation as well, but in my case too, because I grew up in a multi-generational household, I kept hearing bits and pieces of war stories, especially from my grandmother. And there were any number of television dramas and books, children's books, that were about the horrors of war and how much Japanese people suffered. I distinctly remember books about like little girls who lost their fathers in Allied air raids, or little kids orphaned in Hiroshima. And I guess one example, the one famous example, is The Grave of Fireflies. Brother and sister orphaned in Kobe, I believe. But so I half grew up. I moved to the States when I was 9, but before that move, I consumed these narratives because it was everywhere, and so then there's this sense that Japanese people suffered, right? But then there's also this other piece of information that doesn't quite mesh with the Japanese people suffered narrative, which is, this problem of Japan not really working enough on its war responsibility, not apologizing enough to the rest of Asia. And so then how do these two problems come together? And I think a lot of the younger generation now are being caught in between this, and especially the generation that is young right now, right? Like I grew up hearing these narratives because my parents and my grandparents experienced the war. But the younger generation now, their parents haven't experienced the war. In some cases, not even their grandparents. And so this war thing is very, very far away, but they are still feeling this negative sentiment that comes from China, that comes from South Korea. But on the other hand, these stories of Japanese suffering still persists in Japanese society. So this time period is not being taken up in mandatory education in particular, and not even in high schools, which means that many youth are at a loss, I think, when it comes to Japan's past.
The Yasukuni Military Museum, located on the shrine grounds and long affiliated with Yasukuni, has been revamped to appeal to this younger generation by offering a more uplifting version of Japan's past.
Just as with any history museum, if you go through the rooms, it's chronological. You look at the earlier wars, right? Sino-Japanese War, Russo-Japanese War, but the main portion of the display is about the Asia-Pacific War. told in a very revisionist way. And then and using objects, right, like war-stained uniforms or tools or weapons, and then and letters that these men wrote back home. And in the last couple of rooms, you see photographs, hundreds of photographs. You're sort of surrounded by photographs of faces of the men who are enshrined at Yasukuni, and several women. And so, you're surrounded by basically photographs of dead people, right, who died at war. And this is after going through this narrative of, Japan fought back and sacrificed and defended itself. And then you see the faces of these men and some women. And so if you're coming into this with a blank slate, just because you don't really learn about modern Japan in school, right? But you're sort of grappling with this, like, but there was supposed to be all this suffering, but we're supposed to be bad guys. What's going on? And then if you go into that museum with that kind of an attitude, I mean, not everyone, but how there are notebooks at the end of many museums where the visitors would write down, their thoughts. And whenever I go, I would flip through the pages, and there are so many writings about, oh my gosh, I am so proud of my country now. I don't know why nobody taught this in school. I'm so grateful, da da da. And it is a very dangerous tool.
Yasukuni Shrine has become the focal point for the divisions in Japan over the memory of the Asia-Pacific War. Derided by the left for promoting the fanaticism of the past and honored by the right as the preeminent shrine to the nation's war dead, the true complexity of Yasukuni gets lost in the crossfire. Akiko reminds us that Yasukuni has never had one meaning. First a site of leisure and recreation, it took decades for Japan's leaders to transform Yasukuni into a space for the celebration of military victories. It was only at the start of the 20th century that Yasukuni became a sacred site for the nation's war dead. In the post-war years, the LDP used the shrine to build support among bereaved families. The revisionist narrative at the Yasukuni Military Museum now targets a younger generation, unsure about the nation's past. Akiko explains that it is precisely because she prefers to chronicle the complexity of the site, rather than take a side in Japan's memory wars, that Japanese publishers have been reluctant to translate her book. I would like to thank Akiko Takanaka for so kindly sharing her time and thoughts with me. I'm also very grateful to her for directing me to a wealth of online royalty-free images, which I've used on the podcast website and Instagram account. Episode 3 will air in 1 month's time and will feature the memory of the slave trade in Liverpool. Although it was only active in the slave trade for about 50 years, Liverpool ships carried 10% of all the slaves during the entire 400-year history of the Atlantic slave trade. We'll hear from Bristol University historian Jessica Moody on how the memory of the slave trade has persisted in Liverpool over the past 200 years. Follow us on Instagram or Twitter, or go to our website, realmsofmemory.com, for updates on the podcast schedule and details of future episodes. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian, and thank you for listening to Realms of Memory.